I want to get your reaction when you heard what had happened in Paris on Friday night. Brian, I'll begin with you.
Well, I was first stunned by the details, and the sense of being shocked just grew through the whole evening and through the whole weekend. It took a long time to really digest exactly what had happened. But what I felt in my bones from the very first hours on was that this was more than just a game changer. This was a move, the civilization was moving from one era into another, from an era that we regard as peace into one that's a sinister twilight of almost more war than peace. I was first very reluctant to use the term war. I thought it gave far too much propaganda grandeur to ISIS, if you have it. But now I think it's the only appropriate term to use, and I think the French president has used it with great dignity today and called upon a very brave nation to bravely stand up to the reality of the fact that the world is in a war now, and we are going to all have to confront it because there are no options left. There are no options, if there ever were, to be neutral.
I want to talk about the implications of the term war in just a moment, but Lloyd, Axworthy, what was your reaction, your emotional reaction to what had happened?
Well, it was about the same as Brian. It took a while for the sense of shock and sorrow and anguish to sort of come down to what is this about. And there's no doubt that it went to the very heart of what nation states are supposed to do, which is protect their own citizens. And ISIS is really pushing the buttons at where they see the weak spots and the pressure points, and they're using with great skill their knowledge about global media to get that message out. But since then, Carol, I think that we're slowly beginning to understand a little bit more. Some more information comes in. That's why I think it's very important that not too many sort of random initiatives take place without first some really good collaboration and also a sober second thought about what are the implications and consequences. So I think we're now into a time of really active assessment of what do we do now?
One of the assumptions that we had made over time was that what we had to worry about in the Western world was a lone wolf attack and not a coordinated attack. I think many people assumed that the intelligence services had a handle on that and that that they wouldn't get away with it. They certainly wouldn't be able to mastermind this from Syria or Belgium or within France. But we're disabused of that notion today.
Well, Carol, if I can just say, if you put together the Paris attack with what went on the week before, the Russian airliners, the attacks in Lebanon, it's clear that ISIS has now taken on this global strategy. Whether they're doing it out of strength or out of weakness is a good question, but I really think that that really puts on countries, including Canada, an onus to do some rethinking about how we respond to this. And the debate, to me, is very narrow. I think the Prime Minister said we're not going to continue our participation in the bombing attacks. But clearly what this situation calls for is a much broader set of responses and tools and initiatives. And those are the places where I think Canada can be a very important collaborator against ISIS.
Okay, do you think then that the Prime Minister is right to continue to pull back the planes from the fight against ISIS, or does Paris prove otherwise? Brian, I'll begin with you and then I'll bring that question to you, Lloyd.
Well, I think he would be right to delay a decision for a while. I agree with Lloyd. We need to know a lot more about what is going on now. And by that I mean we need to know a bit more about international reaction. Is there, for instance, a possibility the French will declare a NATO Article 5, calling upon all NATO members to come to the aid of France? That would take a significant burden of the campaign pledge off Trudeau. he could then legitimately say the situation has profoundly changed. Or is it even possible that we might see a P5, a UN Security Council resolution calling for the elimination of ISIS, because both Russia and China now are making very strong verbal attacks on ISIS and making it very clear they see it as a world danger. I think we're in a situation right now where we could be forming alliances that we would not even have thought possible just 2 weeks ago. And I think we have a few days here, maybe even a few weeks, where we can really see a lot more of this play out.
Look, to illustrate your point, the Kremlin says that Russia's Vladimir Putin and Francois Hollande will likely meet before the climate summit in Paris at the end of November.
Right. Well, Carol, I think that's one of the factors that, to me, really carries with it a lot of impact on import, and that is slow but deliberate agreements on a kind of a peace process in Syria. And that the Russians and Americans have apparently come to some agreement about who will be included in that. If that takes place, then it's going to put a whole new dimension. For example, if there is a ceasefire, who are going to be the peacekeepers? Is it going to be under the United Nations? I mean, these are issues I think that Canadian foreign policy now has to begin to engage with, because those are areas that we could be of real help in resolving the issue. And if we get a peace process, then many of the other pressure points, the refugee issue, the question of controlling ISIS, begin to look a little bit more feasible, simply because that cesspool of conflict that's taking place there now can be reduced.
But why, if I may, why wouldn't we continue? What is the good argument for Justin Trudeau to pull out the planes now?
If you're asking me, I would be hard-stretched to say it's a very strong argument. Since in the 2 weeks that he's been in office, Canadian planes have continued to bomb. They would not have been bombing had they not been thought to be doing some very useful work. How does one turn around then now and argue that that is not useful work that can be done at least through till March, the end of their mission? I would be surprised if he won't want to visit this more when we get more indication of what the outside world is expecting. For instance, what is France telling Canada? Sorry, what is France telling Canada? We don't really know what kind of talks they've had, how strongly it's urging Canada, please don't pull out now. Or is it saying, no, we understand you made a campaign promise and that's important, and we understand you can really help a lot on the training missions?
Justin Trudeau has said that no one has asked him directly not to pull the planes.
Right.
Well, I think there's always a courtesy and respect at these meetings, but I think it's really up to Canada to put some creative options on the table. I think we really have to stand in solidarity with the French. I mean, the words have been right. I think there needs to be some action. For example, can we substantially re-engage on intelligence issues? I don't think we've had a good, careful look at CSIS and our intelligence apparatus, and not just how it acts for protection in Canada, but how it contributes to the much larger international scheme. I know there's agreements and that we're part of it, but I think here's an area here where there's collaboration between countries to pinpoint where there might be movements of these kinds of attackers is one of the ways that we have to find a different kind of cooperation. Or if I can give another example, the French right now are carrying all the heavy lifting in United Nations peacekeeping operations in Central Africa. Is there something we can work with the French on that? I think the important thing is to say, all right, you've got yourself committed to a very significant intervention for good reason. But are there some other ways that we can be supportive of France at this very difficult and delicate hour?
And I think what publics want too is muscle put on the bone. I mean, I do find the Prime Minister's comments a bit vague. I mean, it looks like we'll pull the plane out, but we'll counterbalance that with training on the ground. I think we should be hearing a bit more about how much study has gone into this, how many units we're thinking about, where we're going to do the retraining. After all, I mean, Trudeau has had the benefit of his chief military advisor being the former head of the Canadian Army, General Leslie, for 2 years now. I'm sure they've done a lot of study, and I think if you can start putting muscle on the bone of promises, and not just military, obviously economic promises are enormously important now. Europe is underfunding refugees by something like $800 million. We've got to do a better job pouring money into this whole stricken area. And in the economy, we need to know more about what the economic blows are going to be and how Canada can help in those areas.
What do you think of Brad Hall's suggestion that Justin Trudeau, the Canadian government right now, suspend its plan to bring in 25,000 refugees by the end of the year? Lloyd Axworthy, I'll begin with you.
Well, I don't want to be unkind. I just think it's a kind of a knee-jerk reaction that he's reading about U.S. governors or other things. I think that would be one of the worst things that we could do, would be to start pulling back and putting new restrictions on what we're doing about refugees. This is not an impossibility to do it. Ralph Goodale, the public safety minister, said, yeah, we've got the capacity to do it, and let's do our best job of it. We may not hit the exact number, but to start saying that we're going to start going backwards and regressing on our promises, I think that would be a very strong counter-reaction in the country to a new government.
Doesn't the government also have the responsibility to say to the public, we are taking steps to make sure that the people who are coming into the country at least we're reasonably sure that they are who they say they are?
But Carol, surely they've been doing that all along. I mean, I've heard many a statement from the government saying, of course we're going to be doing vetting beforehand. We're working with the United Nations to do that. And let's remember overall that the Canadian situation is very, very different from the European ones. We're not facing hundreds of thousands of people walking across borders and just pouring in. We're actually vetting people in the situation where they're at. We can send over as many top security experts as we want to make sure the vetting is done right. We can pick the refugees that seem least likely to be in any way a threat of a cover for ISIS. So we're in a very different situation. For Canada to pull out now, I think would be a bit of a step back when it doesn't have to. We may not meet that 25,000, I agree with Lloyd. But if we hit 15,000, that's still some encouraging movement.
You know, Carol, one of the things I think we need to think about, and that is that Parliament will be coming back into session in a couple of weeks' time. In that interim, the Prime Minister is going to be, he's been at the G20, he's going to Commonwealth meetings, he's going to be meeting with the APEC. This is a really good chance for him to pull together what he sees as some emerging consensus of how to deal with global terrorism. And then I think we can have a good, open parliamentary examination of it. I mean, that was one of the major commitments during the election, was to say, let's use Parliament as a way in which we get information to Canadians, that we get a debate going, that we are able to examine the options. And so I think that there is a good two-step approach here. He has now got access to virtually all his peers, and then he can bring it back and say, okay, here's the Canadian overall strategy, here's what we think we can do right away, here's what we're not going to do, and put a lot of these sort of quick fix kind of proposals coming from the opposition and other places to rest.
Okay. Well, we have to leave it there. There's so much more to talk about, as, you know, for example, whether Article 5 would ever be invoked and who you would name as the target of that. But that, sadly, is a conversation for another day. Brian Stewart of the Munk School of Global Affairs in Toronto and former Minister of Foreign Affairs Lloyd Axworthy in Winnipeg. Always a pleasure. Thank you.
Thank you, Carol.
Thank you.